Trump outtakes, Bannon convicted, and Biden gets COVID.
I don't want to say the election's over.
The January 6th committee holds another striking primetime hearing, revealing never-before-seen video.
President Trump did not fail to act during the 187 minutes. He chose not to act.
Lawmakers focus on why President Trump did not call off the mob during the Capitol attack.
Donald Trump knows that millions of Americans who supported him would stand up and defend our nation were it threatened. And on January 6th, Donald Trump turned their love of country into a weapon against our Capitol and our Constitution.
And condemn his actions. Plus,
I'm doing well, I'm getting a lot of work done, it's gonna be okay.
President Biden, the most powerful and protected man in America, tests positive for COVID-19. What his diagnosis means for the country, and what it says about the virus's unrelenting threat. Next.
This is Washington Week. Corporate funding is provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular's goal has been to provide wireless service that helps people communicate and connect. We offer a variety of no-contract plans, and our U.S.-based customer service team can help find one that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again from Washington, moderator Yamiche Alcindor.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. This was another busy week full of news. During a Thursday night public hearing, the January 6th committee went in deep on 187 minutes. Lawmakers say that's the time between when former President Trump ended his January 6th speech on the Mall and when he finally told his supporters attacking the Capitol to go home. According to the committee, Trump chose not to act as part of a deliberate plan to delay certifying the vote. And lawmakers say he only told the rioters to go home after it became clear to him that they had failed to stop the proceedings. During the primetime event, there was also new video of outtakes, that's right, outtakes, of a pre-recorded speech given by former President Trump the day after the attack. It showed his reluctance to condemn the mob and how his daughter, Ivanka Trump, coached him through the remarks.
But this election is now over. Congress has certified the results. I don't want to say the election's over. I just want to say Congress has certified the results without saying the election's over, okay?
Now Congress.
Yeah, right.
Now Congress.
I didn't say over, so let me see. Go to the paragraph before.
The committee also revealed that Secret Service agents at the Capitol with former Vice President Mike Pence thought they might be killed.
The members of the VP detail at this time were starting to fear for their own lives. It was disturbing. There were calls to say goodbye to family members, so on and so forth.
Two former Trump White House officials also testified about why they resigned on January 6th. This also comes, of course, as Steve Bannon, which is another big story, a former top Trump advisor, was found guilty of contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with the subpoena from the January 6th committee. He now faces up to 2 years in prison. So when I told you that we had a busy week, we really meant a busy week. So joining us to discuss this and more, Hallie Jackson, senior Washington correspondent for NBC News and NBC News Now anchor, someone I've spent a lot of time with in the last couple days. We also have Balz here in the studio, chief correspondent for the Washington Post, and of course our dear friend Nikole Killion, congressional correspondent for CBS News. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Nikole, I have to start with you. You're on the beat that is sort of the central place where we're all looking right now. I wonder, when you think about sort of Thursday's hearing in particular, with lawmakers trying to really dig in on what in the world President Trump was doing during the Capitol attack, what sticks out most to you, and when you think about just sort of what lawmakers are trying to telegraph here?
Well, really, the committee has been building
up to this moment from day one. I mean, since the committee has been formed, one of the key things from the outset they said they wanted to focus on were those 187 minutes. What was the president doing during that time? And so we finally got to see minute by minute, in their view, some of the evidence that they were able to uncover. I think one of the more remarkable things was, as you showed at the top of the show, some of those outtakes of the former president having to rework his script. You know, I talked to Elaine Luria, who led this panel, and she talked about how, you know, the former president has always been so congenial. You know, TV is his thing. He was this big reality star, and yet, you know, he couldn't get the words out, right? So, you know, her objective was to allow viewers at home to draw their own conclusions. But look, there was a lot that came out of this, from, you know, those tapes where we heard for the first time about the danger that the former vice president's detail faced. You know, we were well aware of those "Hang Mike Pence" chants, but again, and we've seen that evacuation video, but again, to hear the fact that some of these people were calling their families, I mean, it kind of reminds you of like 9/11, really, right? You know, where people were calling home. So from that standpoint, look, there were many new revelations, and I think from here, the committee is simply looking to continue this investigation because they continue to get more evidence, and certainly more to come as they continue hearings in the fall.
Well, there's a lot to discuss, and you broke a lot of it down so well. Hallie, of course, Nikole's talking about outtakes. It was the moment where a lot of my sources literally gasped, right? It was the moment where we saw the reality TV president that we all covered together, stumbling through, not being able to say, not wanting to say that the election is over, not wanting to say that the people who had literally broken into the Capitol just a day before should be held really responsible for what they were doing. I wonder what you make of the significance of those outtakes, and what it really tells us about the former president's frame of mind.
I have to tell you, Yamiche, and we were sitting on set when this was happening, right? As the committee was playing out these outtakes, and it was a gasp-worthy moment. I think it's objectively safe to say that. That said, it wasn't altogether shocking that former President Trump would still, given everything that we've seen in the many, many months that have passed since January 6th, would be denying, right, the legitimate election results after. I think what the committee effectively was able to do here was, by juxtaposing the violence at the Capitol, showing this footage of the rioters, showing the footage that we hadn't seen before of the Secret Service radio calls that were happening. You could hear how frantic it sounded, how under duress they were, and the testimony from the unnamed White House security official who was listening in to these radio calls and suggesting these suggestions, perhaps the VP, the vice president, would have been compromised. I mean, step back and think about that. Juxtaposing that, right, to less than 24 hours later, former President Trump being unable to get out the words, I think was significant. You talk about how for your sources that was a key moment. Can I tell you what another key moment was for somebody that I talked to? And that's something that's not getting a ton of attention, but it's at the end of the hearing when, as Nikole mentioned, Congresswoman Elaine Luria, who was leading part of the hearing, played a huge role. She referenced the first responders who were defending the Capitol that day. And I think it's important to talk about that because, remember, there are people right behind this video that we see and this footage that we see and this huge political and historic story that we're covering here. There are people who died. There are people whose lives will never be the same. There are people who are suffering from trauma. And when Congressman Luria said that, you saw a shot of these officers sitting in the front row, one of them, Officer Harry Dunn, who I talked with late last night. And he said that the moment that stuck with him, the thing that he is still rattled by, was what you referenced, that Secret Service testimony from this White House official, that people were calling their families to say goodbye. That shook Officer Dunn. And he had told me beforehand, too, he was really bracing for sort of the emotional impact of this because it spoke to the intensity and the seriousness of this moment, Yamiche.
That is really a great way to really think about this, and such a smart thing to point out. That was such a, I think, chilling moment here. Dan, I want to come to you because there was another striking moment that stuck out to you, and it was about what President Trump was tweeting during the Capitol attack. It's that 2:24 p.m. tweet where literally former Vice President Mike Pence is running through the Capitol, being evacuated, and Trump is criticizing him publicly. Why did that moment stick out to you, and why did you want to write about it this week?
I'll tell you why, because we know this hearing was billed as what President Trump did not do for that 187 minutes. But what struck me, and particularly with that tweet, was what he did. I mean, it wasn't that he simply sat passive the entire time. He did things, and that tweet is symbolic of the kind of the belligerence that he had over what was going on. Here's a moment when everybody around him in the White House believes that he should walk down to the briefing room and make a statement to national audience and tell the people rioting on the Capitol grounds to go home. Instead, he sends a tweet attacking his own vice president, calling him a coward, in essence, putting gasoline on this fire that's already raging. And it just was striking to me how indifferent he was to not just the safety of his vice president, but to the threat that was underway at the Capitol.
It was absolutely striking, and Nikole, in some ways, there was so much in this hearing, but I want to, I guess, in some ways, focus you back onto this Secret Service, these details about people calling their family. Hallie talked really deeply about them. What are you hearing from lawmakers on Capitol Hill? Because you're obviously walking the halls where these people were saying, I might have to call my family because I might not ever see them again.
Well, I mean, there's that, and then there's also this issue of these deleted text messages, right, that the committee is trying to get a hold of. And so, that we continue to see more developments on that front. And I think, many on the committee are very frustrated that they cannot get the information that they need. I mean, there's a lot with respect to the Secret Service. I mean, it's not just this protection element, but it's also, that whole story we heard from Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony a couple of weeks back, where there was this altercation with the former president and his detail. And so we also heard last night more about that from this retired D.C. police sergeant, which I also thought was interesting in terms of them broadcasting some of his testimony. And so we know that some members of the panel have now said that some members of this detail may have retained private counsel. So look, there are a lot of legs to this story, and that is why you heard the committee last night say, look, we are not done. Our work is continuing in August before we resume with these hearings in September.
Saying it has a lot of legs is definitely a good way to put it, because Hallie, we are continuing to see former President Trump attacking this committee. Just this week, we heard that he was calling Wisconsin officials, trying to get them to still overturn their election results. All this is happening as the hearing showed that Donald Trump was, they say, spent time calling senators, we're not sure which senators, while Rudy Giuliani was leaving messages for senators saying, hey, you should try to slow down this process even more. I wonder if you could connect what was happening on January 6th to what we know is happening in real time.
It's such a great point, Yamiche, because, and then, oh, by the way, right, the investigation in Georgia that is happening simultaneously to all of this too, right? There's a lot of threads here that are disparate but connected in some ways. And I think that is going to be, it has to be, one would think, the focus of what the committee, or at least a part of what the committee is going to talk about come September. Because think about what they've done, Yamiche, over the last couple of months here, right? Since early June when these hearings started. They very clearly laid out an arc, right? They wanted to make sure, and they talked about this. Members talked about it with me, they talked about it with you and others, that they wanted to make sure that they were crafting something that would be compelling to people as they laid down an accurate record of history, right? There's a lot of questions about the accountability factor, what happens with the Justice Department from here, but for these initially 7 and then 8 hearings, it was about a record of history, right? To come back in September now, and yes, Vice Chair Liz Cheney has said the dam has begun to break, that the door is open, there's more witnesses, more subpoenas, active information coming into them. But for them to come back in September to hold more hearings, as they are going to do, you've got to think that there is a bar that they want to try to hit, right, with the way that they have conducted these hearings so far. And I think that what you're talking about with these phone calls that former President Trump is continuing to make to people in Wisconsin, with what the Fulton County District Attorney is continuing to uncover, the testimony that we expect to hear from Rudy Giuliani down there, for example, that these are going to be part and parcel of some of the threads that the January 6th committee will try to pull on, Yamiche. And I will just say, too, as we talk about this sort of big picture, Donald Trump is engaging in this. Right. Donald Trump is watching this. We know he's watching this. We know what channel he is watching this on, because he was tweeting, truth socialing, I should say, poorly about one of those channel's anchors, calling, Liz Cheney a sanctimonious loser. So he is to some degree engaging in this. There is a political component here, too, that is not going away, especially as we get closer to the midterms.
This political component is clearly not going away. And we know that, Dan, because just today we had new information, a new development, which is that Steve Bannon was found guilty of failing to comply with a subpoena from Congress. I wonder what you make of the political significance of that, but also, of course, of the significance of that to the committee's work, because it's clear they're taking this seriously.
They are taking it very seriously, and they were quick to respond to that conviction to say that this is an indication of the seriousness with which we are approaching this job. This was in many ways an open and shut case. It was clear when the trial started that he was likely to be convicted, in part because of some of the choices that the judge had made. But it is significant. It says if you defy this committee, you run the risk of going to jail. And I suspect we have not heard the last of Steve Bannon from this committee as they continue to dig in and look at other aspects of it.
And if I could give you a follow-up question here, there's a lot of pressure being placed on the DOJ because there are a lot of Democrats who are looking that way and saying, okay, well, what's the DOJ going to do now? What do you make of sort of the pressure Merrick Garland, Attorney General Merrick Garland, is facing, and the sort of potential that criminal referrals could be handed down from the DOJ?
It seems to be that there are two main objectives of the January 6th committee. One is to ratchet up the pressure on Merrick Garland to look at this as seriously as possible. He's got a very, very difficult decision, and we don't have to go into all of the details of that, but it is clear that this is a fraught decision for him, and whatever way he decides will touch off a firestorm. But that's one element of it. The case they have laid out, which is not necessarily a case that you would bring strictly in this way in a courtroom. They would face a different challenge through the Justice Department if they do in fact indict the president. But they have laid out so much evidence about this former president that it is forcing, I think, the Justice Department to really think about whether they will take that, in essence, fateful step. I think the other goal was from what Liz Cheney had to say in her close last night, and that is, given the choices that this president made on January 6th, should he ever again be allowed to hold a position of authority in the government? And that's a political question. And almost no matter what happens with the Justice Department, that is a question that will go before the voters probably in 2024 if he runs.
Certainly. And Nikole, when we think about sort of all of the sort of political implications here, we have to go back to something that Hallie mentioned, which is that Liz Cheney said the dam is broken. There are going to be more hearings, plural, for those at home, that's with an S, in September. Talk a bit about what lawmakers think they want to learn, what we know about this new information, new witnesses coming forward, but also sort of what are the unanswered questions that they want to get at?
Well, I do want to just piggyback off of Dan's point real quick, just because one of my colleagues at CBS, Just Gaze, did ask the Attorney General this week about potentially prosecuting Trump, and he replied saying no one is above the law. Now, that doesn't necessarily, mean he's going to act, but I do think
it was notable when he said that, yeah. So thanks for bringing that up, yeah.
Absolutely, but, look, in terms of what's next, we knew that the committee would likely hold more hearings. At minimum, they have to complete a report, likely an interim report sometime in September, so they want to use at least one hearing to try to focus on that in terms of really outlining some of their key findings, and then they intend to put out a more comprehensive report perhaps later this year. Chairman Benny Thompson and others have indicated that they are not making the midterms a factor in terms of when they put that information out, but as all of us know in politics, we're very familiar with the October surprise. So who knows what the committee has up its sleeve, but again, as they get more information, they have said that they could hold more hearings simply based on some of this new information that they find already. We know with respect to the Secret Service, that's not off the table in terms of a future hearing. So again, we'll have to see.
Yeah, well, when you said Secret Service and October surprise, my head started spinning. But I'm going to try to also just think about the other story that happened this week, because the big other story is this. The President of the United States, President Biden, has COVID-19, and according to the White House, his symptoms are mild, and he is working in quarantine from the residence. You see those pictures of him working from home, essentially. Still, he is a 79-year-old man. That means even though he is vaccinated and twice boosted, he is in a high-risk category high-risk group for severe illness. To talk more about this, we're joined by Yasmeen Abutaleb, national reporter for the Washington Post. Yasmeen, as soon as I heard the president had COVID, I was like, please, someone call Yasmeen. We need her on the show. So I'm just going to let you have it. Talk to us a little bit about how the president's feeling, what we know about sort of the latest about his condition, but also sort of what have you been hearing from your sources, health sources, about the way forward for him?
So it seems like, fortunately, the president is doing pretty well and seems to have a mild case of COVID. His doctor has put out 2 letters. The White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, and the White House coronavirus response coordinator, Ashish Jha, have done 2 pretty extensive briefings about how he's doing and his symptoms. So far, he seems to have a cough, a runny nose, some fatigue. His temperature went up a little bit, but now seems to be normal. And importantly, his oxygen, his heart rate are all normal. And so, and speaking with doctors, they said the thing you would look for with someone like the president, who is 79, or really anyone who develops COVID, is whether they start developing shortness of breath. It doesn't seem that's happened to the president, and the White House has gone to pretty extensive lengths to show that he's fine and he's working and he's continuing to work through his infection. He had a bit of a hoarse voice today when he appeared for a public event, but otherwise, I think it's not really that surprising that he would have gotten COVID, especially given his travel schedule recently, the number of public events he's done. He's a very kind of glad-handing politician, lots of backslaps and hugging, and so the White House had been preparing for this for a matter of months.
And Yasmeen, I want to ask you something else, which is that as he, of course, is the most powerful man in America, you could say, someone who's very protected, he is joining millions of other Americans who now have COVID. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the overall threat to the country, and especially what that means for the least among us, the most vulnerable, because that continues, at least based on my reading, to be people of color, poor people, people who can't work from home.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great point, Yamiche. I mean, the president is the most protected person in the country. And, the White House had pretty extensive safety protocols in place to protect him, which included anyone who met with him indoors had to mask, very regular testing. And then, of course, they caught his infection early. So he got access to the antiviral Paxlovid early, which definitely helps. And I think it highlights BA.5 has taken over the country. The reported cases are at a little over 100,000, but experts think it's up to 10 times that, 1 million or more cases a day, just given how rampantly it's spreading right now. This is the most contagious and transmissible variant that we've seen. And I think the fact that the president, with all the protections he has in place, is still getting COVID just reflects the challenge that we're all facing right now. Most people have had it at this point. I think about 70% of the country has had a COVID infection at this point. The majority of the country is vaccinated, and still this variant has shown a remarkable ability to escape immunity that's afforded by vaccinations or previous infection. And so I think it's just a reflection of how difficult it is for the country to get a handle on the virus, 2.5 years in now. And like you said, the White House has tried to use his infection to say, look, we want everyone to have access to the tools the president has access to that have kept his case mild. Boosters, they're free and available, Paxlovid. But the reality is, in a lot of communities, including communities of color and poorer communities, it's really not that easy to get access to these tools, especially the antivirals.
Such a good point. And Hallie, in the minute that we have left here, I want to come to you. There's this new polling week. You should put it up for people. The most recent PBS NewsHour Marist NPR poll shows that President Biden's approval rating has been at his lowest since his presidency. It's at its lowest since his presidency. Obviously, the president wants to be out on the road. Hallie wanted to be talking about his agenda, but now he's stuck indoors. How might this just impact sort of politically where he wants to be?
The White House hopes very little, Yamiche, because they have been talking now for weeks about the idea that once we hit this point of the summer, once he gets through these overseas trips, he'd be out on the road, he'd be hustling ahead of the midterms, right? I mean, that was something that was previewed for a long time. So to have the president sort of isolated here in the White House, they are trying to do as much as they can to show he's still working. They released photos. They're talking all the time about the calls he's making. They're trying, they say, to be transparent. I think that's a question. I think that's something that I know a lot of reporters will be staying on top of to make sure they're getting information from the White House in a timely way. But this is not, listen, it is the summer, right? This isn't September. This isn't October. So it's not like the window is closing. I think we often see that Americans' engagement, especially with the midterms, picks up after Labor Day, for example. And so I think that the White House is going to be eager to get the president on the road. But they also understand that they want to make sure they are following to the T every CDC guideline, because they got to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk here as it relates to how the president is going to handle this. You've seen Dr. Biden, for example, staying in Wilmington, or staying in Delaware, I should say, out of the White House, out of the way of the president. They're really trying to be modeling here some behavior that they want to see the rest of Americans take.
Yeah, and Dan, in the last 30 seconds, it's a lot different thinking about what Hallie is talking about, sort of the protocols that the Biden administration is taking versus what we saw under the Trump administration. Different times because, of course, there was no vaccines. But just talk a bit about that.
Well, I think that's the major difference we see. When President Trump got COVID, there were no vaccinations, and he was in quite bad shape, as we later learned. The White House is trying to use this, in a sense, as a teaching moment, that we have these tools available and we ought to begin to try to use them, and those who have not taken advantage ought to do so.
Well, I will say I hope that President Biden has a safe and quick recovery. I know so many people that have dealt with COVID-19, so I hope that he feels better. So thank you so much, all of us, to all of you at home for watching, and thank you to the panelists for joining us and for sharing your reporting. Dan, Nikole, and Hallie and I will continue our conversation about the January 6 hearings and the criminal investigation into the missing Secret Service text messages on the Washington Week Extra. Find it on our website, Facebook, and YouTube. And before we go, tune in to PBS News Weekend tomorrow for anchor Jeff Bennett's exclusive interview with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Thank you all for joining us. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week is provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Ku and Patricia Ewens with the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.